Good day, everyone, and welcome to panel 11 in this Infrastructure Africa meeting. My name is Dave Wright, and I'm an independent energy consultant, having had a number of years in the refining and marketing industry, and prior to that, chemicals and mining, and I spent a bit of time in the academia. In today's session, we're going to be talking about green hydrogen and the impact it could have on Africa. And the point, of course, is, as everybody has seen and heard, there's massive hype around the potential for green hydrogen to impact both the energy sector and the chemical sector, not just locally in South Africa, but in Africa as a continent. And the main demand is coming out of the Northern Hemisphere. Germany in particular has made it very clear that they want lots of green hydrogen, as has Japan. I have a very good panel here today. I have Jackal Ferris, Mahendra Rupala, Thabo Molekelo, and Ibrahim Tsikolia. And together we're going to discuss this topic of green hydrogen in Africa today. I will ask each panel member to introduce themselves as they start their session. And once they have each had their say around the issue of green hydrogen, we'll engage ourselves in a panel discussion. So welcome once again. We look forward to a really good session with you. And I'd like to kick off by asking Jackal to have his say. Jackal, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dave. Just for the purpose of the audience, so again, my name is Jackal Ferris. I am director at Cliff de Gaafmeyer. I'm also the sector head of our industrials, manufacturing and trade sector, which is a new sector which we started at the end of last year, specifically with reference to the developments in the new industry space, so hydrogen, e-mobility, robotics, and automation, and also fundamentally trade and investment in South Africa and on the continent with reference to the AfCFTA, or more known as the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So tapping into what is the potential for the African market and economy with reference to new industries and where Africa can play a very important role. Now, for purposes of our discussion today, so as a lawyer, lawyers, we are concerned with policy and law, and ultimately how industries should be regulated to make sure it's done in the most efficient way to ensure that from a commercial perspective, investors make money, investors are able to efficiently invest in a particular jurisdiction where the rules are clear in respect of the investment decisions they make, and also from a trade perspective, because ultimately when we talk about hydrogen, we talk about the product that needs to be produced on a cost-effective and a competitive basis, and that product needs to be ultimately evacuated out of South Africa. So firstly, we look at a domestic market, but we also look at the more bigger market for South Africa when we talk about exports. So exports of green hydrogen or other derivatives of green hydrogen out of ports that needs to be developed, such as Breakaway Panel, and also what's happening in Namibia in terms of the development by Hyphen, the Namibian government's efforts in respect of making sure that Namibia and the Southern African region is seen as a hub for export of green hydrogen, both to Europe as probably one of the biggest markets, and then also to Asia, in particular Japan, South Korea, and the other Asian economies. Now, from a policy perspective, and we can see this also with reference to the release of the beginning of this year of the Hydrogen Society roadmap. So when we talk about Africa and when we talk about the potential for Africa, we need to talk about what's happening in Southern Africa, and in particular what's happening in Northern Africa. And why is that important from a green hydrogen and policy perspective is we know that South Africa has abundance of sun radiation and also wind resources. So that's both in Namibia and South Africa. And based on various expert reports, as we've seen by the International Energy Agency, by the International Hydrogen Council, there's a good case to be made out for South Africa and Namibia to be one of the leading exporters for green hydrogen. Now, what is important to ensure that that's done? So policy, what do we mean by policy? Policy certainty in respect of actually setting out how this will be achieved in terms of the different value chains, from the production, the storage, and the distribution of how you will actually evacuate the product and create a market, both from a demand side and a supply side. And we see that again with reference to what's happening in Europe. So the European Commission, the German government, as you've also mentioned, Dave, the Dutch government and a number of other European governments have a vested interest also looking at the geopolitical changes with reference to what's happening in Russia, that we need to invest in hydrogen or green hydrogen. And the biggest reason for that is also decarbonization. And we shouldn't forget about that, because hydrogen is seen as a missing piece to the puzzle for the decarbonization of the global economy. And if you look at Africa in particular, we look at what is the contribution of Africa to carbon emissions. It's estimated about 3% of the global total greenhouse gas emissions, whereas the Northern Hemisphere contributes more than 80% of the entire greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a big market from an African perspective to tap into the potential for green hydrogen production, storage, and distribution to Europe. And with that, again, policy and regulation is important. And if we look at policy, so South Africa, as I mentioned, issued the Green Hydrogen Society Roadmap. It's a roadmap, it's not policy. So there's still a lot of policy that needs to speak to actually dealing with tax incentives, dealing with these other elements in terms of safety standards, certification of green hydrogen in terms of, is it actually green or is it grey hydrogen? Because there's a potential for the development of a black market also for hydrogen, where it is purported to be green, but it's actually grey. So all of those regulatory concerns need to be developed around and streamlined in South Africa, regionally with Namibia and South Africa, and continentally. If we look at, again, what's happening in Namibia, we have the Harambee Prosperity Plan, where the Namibian government is actually busy with a proposed synthetic fuel policy and also legislation that actually will support the hydrogen economy specifically. The only other country, if we can think of it, that actually has a piece of legislation specifically dealing with hydrogen is South Korea. They're the only country that has a piece of legislation dealing with the entire value chain of hydrogen and incentives around it. So there are significant opportunities for Africa, both from the citizenship of Africa, when we talk about the AFCFTA, in building investment, getting investment, and also having intra-Africa trade amongst each other, using our resources to do that. So there's the and I don't want to take too much time, also the fuel cells segment of that, where we can, from automotive perspective, making sure that those policies are clear and incentivizing the companies like Toyota, Nissan to also invest more, although they're already doing that, invest more in creating downstream industries on the continent in Africa, and more broadly, decarbonizing the global economy. That's my few words for the intro. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Well, it's very good of you to highlight the policy issue, because I think it's something which often people don't look at, and yet it is such a critical component of making the wheels turn in the system. So thank you very much for that, and linking it through to the whole trade game, and sort of identifying how we've still got a long way to go, both within South Africa and from a regional point of view. As our next panelist, I'd like to ask Mahendra to step up and ask and provide us with his input, please, if you don't mind. Thank you, Mahendra.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon to all. So first, as an introduction, I'm working at the Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa, IDC. And for those who don't know, IDC is the South African Development Finance Institution. I'm working as an industry planner, focusing on the energy industry and focusing on hydrogen. So IDC has also been involved in a hydrogen panel that was set up by Minister Patel, which is constituted of business leaders, the aim of which was to develop a hydrogen commercialization strategy. Now Jack will reference the Hydrogen Society roadmap that the DSI released in February. We're developing a commercialization strategy that will leverage that roadmap and provide more detail on how we commercialize the industry in South Africa. So I want to chat a bit on the pillars and the enablers for commercialization of the industry. I think we need to firstly recognize that this industry is not new in the globally, right? So we must stop talking about technology development. It's moved past that stage. The technology is actually old. And secondly, in South Africa also, it's not new. In fact, as far as 2007, we've had activity where the National Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technology Strategy was developed by the Department of Science and Innovation. And over the next 10 or so years in the country, from about 2008 to 2018, there were various demonstration projects in the country. And as also mentioned, more recently, the DSI started the development of the Hydrogen Society roadmap, which was released in February. And I think our chair today also mentioned the hype, but there's more than hype. And we see that now there's a real market pull. And we've come to a point where we need to take advantage of commercializing this industry for South Africa. And that's why recently the minister set up a panel to develop the commercialization strategy. Over the past, I think, few months, we've seen, very much more encouraging activity happening, like the Anglo-American launching the new Gen Zero emissions, haulage hydrogen-powered mine truck as an example. There were announcements made at COP26. The presidency has also announced this being one of the strategic infrastructure pillars. And I think more importantly, in the news, we've seen announcements of a number of projects, hydrogen and ammonia generation projects in the country. So I think the opportunity for South Africa, for me, can be covered in 4 areas. So it's a global opportunity to export and to trade. And that's an opportunity for us to bring in investment into the country, but also bring in export revenue. And if you look at what was announced recently by Europe, Repower EU, they have actually increased their targets now for 2030. They want to import 10 million tons. Now that was initially going to be done at 2050, but because of the Russian crisis, they have now accelerated the import targets. And that's an opportunity for South Africa, a global opportunity to trade. Secondly, I think it was mentioned that we have certain national endowments. That's our land, wind, solar resources. We have PGMs. We have a petrochemical base. So we can use that to leverage a competitive or globally comparative position for South Africa in this area. So that's the second opportunity. The third opportunity is a just transition opportunity. And this is linked to the fact that we are now developing a new industry for South Africa. And as part of developing a new industry, we need to proactively also ensure that the socio-economic part is also developed in parallel. And with that comes the just transition element and the skills development element. So that's the third opportunity for South Africa. And I think the fourth and final one we can, which is always comes up front, is a decarbonization opportunity. So it is certainly a decarbonization global opportunity and for South Africa. And we know that green hydrogen can decarbonize much more than renewable energy can, because we can put it into industrial processes like steel manufacturing, petrochemical production to decarbonize. So that's how I see the opportunity for South Africa. Now, I just want to touch a bit on what the commercialization strategy pillars will be. So the first key pillar for us will be the export market. And we see from a timing perspective, that's something we need to take advantage of. early. That's number one. And that will include Europe, but it will also include markets in the East. The second pillar would be, I think, Jack well mentioned, also the domestic market. So we have projected what the demand can be, and it's encouraging that both the export market and the domestic market can be quite encouraging, right? So we need to start stimulating the usage in the domestic market in various applications, like in green steel, petrochemical, and mobility. So that's the second pillar. The third pillar of the commercialization would be attracting investment and finance. And because of the quantum of funding we need, firstly, we need to crowd in from a number of institutions. That will be DFIs, but also, very importantly, from the private players. And it's not only the quantum, but the type of funding that we need to attract. We need to attract the grants. We need to attract concessional debt, and we need to take advantage of pricing subsidy schemes like the S2 Global. The fourth pillar is, as I mentioned previously, the socio-economic development part. The fifth one is the industrialization part, right? So we need to also, to enable us to have a longer-term competitive advantage in the country, we need to be able to target the manufacture of equipment and components. And this will be fuel cells, this will be electrolyzers, but this will also be balance of plant equipment with cross-sectorial synergies that we can get out of it. And I think the last pillar would be the just transition element. And we need to see how we take the communities that's now going to lose their jobs from the carbon-intensive industries, reskill them and empower them to now work in the new hydrogen industry. This all has to be supported by a solid base of getting the right policy, regulations, and government support in place. And that will include regulations, firstly, for example, making sure we have the right type of energy planning regime for all the gigawatts we need to generate green hydrogen, or the policy support, things like carbon pricing or incentives to use hydrogen vehicles. So I think that will form a solid foundation for the pillars to commercialize. And I think finally, what I want to touch a bit on is some of those enablers. Now, I think the first key enabler is having a very coordinated approach from a country perspective. So this talks to, firstly, having a roadmap, having a commercialization strategy, but speaking with one voice from a country perspective, having a national coordination. And specifically, we see going forward, specifically on the infrastructure side, we need a coordinated approach when we're talking about things like port infrastructure, rail infrastructure. So that's the first pillar, first enabler is the coordination. The second one, which I spoke about, is regulatory and framework, so I won't go into that again. The third enabler would be the finance and investment, as I mentioned. The fourth enabler, which I touched on, is catalytic projects. This is so important, getting activity on the ground, learning, and then ramping up. So there's three key areas of projects, and we have seen announcements in the public domain, projects that's targeting green hydrogen production and the derivatives for both the export market and local use. And that could include beneficiation in steel, right, as an example. The second type would be the equipment manufacturing projects that also there's activity in the country. There's companies that have set up to manufacture equipment, and there's other projects that's being developed. The third area will be those mobility projects. And it's very important here to mention something like the Hydrogen Valley work that was done by the DSI and Anglo and Bombili Energy, and the spin-off projects coming out of that. So catalytic projects are a very important enabler in this industry. And the final key enabler to me will be the skills development to ensure that just transition happens. So I think we're very bullish about this industry. We do see the real market opportunity. South Africa needs to act quickly. It's an opportunity now to act quickly and take full advantage of this. And we're quite excited about going forward with this. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mahendra. It's really been very interesting and very helpful, I think, to hear that the IDC is developing a commercialization strategy, and thank you very much for unpacking it as you did. And I think that gives us quite an interesting segue into asking Thabo to talk about his views and his input on green hydrogen, because I imagine, Dava, your business would be potentially involved in manufacturing or industrial development and application of green hydrogen. So over to you, Dava.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for inviting us as well. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel this afternoon, and also especially talking about the emerging green hydrogen economy. I think we will all agree, and even some of the panel members, around hydrogen perhaps being the most efficient and potentially a better carbon-free energy carrier, and Africa being quite positioned well to benefit from it. I think we possess one of the key components to be a leader in this industry, and I think it could be something quite exciting. So it's a positive time for us in the energy industry as Siemens Energy, and more or less more so today. Maybe just a brief background on ourselves. So we are an integrated energy technology company with a strong ESG focus. And our integration lies around the value chain, which covers anything from gas, solar PV, wind, biomass, and even some small hydro. And more importantly, production and storage of green hydrogen. So our technologies obviously also cover transmission and distribution of the energy as well, including battery storage solutions. So our expertise are quite varied along the value chain. We do play a strong part around engineering, automation, and even providing some of the digital solutions, including cybersecurity, as we see how technologies are progressing. Just to bring it back a little bit home, in South Africa, we're a level 1B company, and we have servicing facilities to assist in not only when we deploy these technologies, but also to sustain them, and also partake in making sure we have proactive skills in some of these technologies that we roll out. And I think Mahendra alluded to skills as part of the conversation, and I think we'll delve deeper into that one. So overall, our primary focus is to transition our customers to a low carbon energy system while we balance the sustainable, reliable, and affordable energy requirements. My role is the Chairman and Managing Director for Siemens Energy Southern Africa, and I'm entrusted to ensure that we drive this vibrant topic itself. I just wanted to also, in my introduction, give a little bit of context, and I think Mahendra touched on it a little bit, that we've been here before. Hydrogen is not new, but I think there's a convergence of certain trends that has necessitated this to be quite an attractive conversation to have now. But a little anecdote is that actually in Africa, the first green hydrogen project that was done was in the 1960s. It actually was in Egypt, powered by hydro. So it was a 200 megawatt electrolyzer process, producing something about 400 tons of 450 tons of green hydrogen. And the second one was in the 70s, not too far from us. It was actually in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe produced something like about 165 megawatt electrolysis process. I think at the time it was, maybe it might still be in operation, but it was run by Sable Chemicals. So we are not in an unfamiliar territory. We know we've been here before. And I just think a couple of trends that have driven this convergence to get to the hydrogen economy has enabled us this to be favorable. And one of those is the conversation around pressure, around climate regulations, pressure around financing into this space. We've seen anything from the Paris Agreement to European Green Deals, Germany asserting itself, doing various partnerships, not only in South Africa, but also in Namibia, that we know that we also play a part of. The second aspect, which I think is more important, is the economics. The economics have shifted in a sense that there's been a declining cost of the renewable electricity. We've seen in South Africa from the first bid window to where we are now, there's been a market reduction in new PV and wind, especially because they are necessary inputs into this secondary energy carrier that we talk about. And I think for South Africa, even Namibia as well, it gives us a fair amount of advantage to play into this dynamic. The second one is that there has been also attractive solutions that has been there as a trend. So the hard to abate sectors that we talk about that where direct electrification wouldn't have happened, now they can embrace an element of renewable energy and coupling it with green hydrogen storage and so on, makes it quite attractive. And that gives rise to an element around power fuels. And power fuels as well, not only from those hard to abate sectors, but also around public policy support to offtake and import some of these power fuels. We've seen anything from Japan, the Europeans, Union as well. Germany is also quite vocal and clear about that. So I think in all of these, we are quite clear that we're not in unfamiliar territory and so on. I think the real question we have to be asking is that, are we doing enough? There's a lot of us in terms of advantages to do that. And I'll talk a little bit later about, we've done several pilots at Siemens Energy globally, 6 or 8 or so of those. And we've picked up a lot of important lessons out of those pilots. And those pilots didn't come only from an economic sense in terms of numbers, whether they add up, but they came with a lot of lessons, a lot of how to do, and a lot of experience that we could plug into the bigger one. So I look forward to a fruitful conversation around how do we do more and how do we speed up this emerging sector.
Thanks very much indeed, Thabo. I really appreciated your giving us the history and the context that green hydrogen for Africa is certainly not new. And it's not something I think many people appreciate. And I too look forward to any comments you can make later about how we can get this whole process going. Our final panelist, and by no means the last, is Ebram Tikolia. And the benefit I think Ebram will bring is Ebram comes to this as an entrepreneur. So we've had quite a good spread of people and experiences around the panel. So Ebram, I look forward to your contribution, sir.
Sure. Hi, Dave. Thank you for the introduction. Director and CEO of Green Hydrogen Solutions. We are a South African and UK company. And the nexus for the company was really the experience in the natural gas industry and seeing a lot of the push factors moving to hydrogen. I initially started looking at hydrogen very skeptically, especially green hydrogen, but then realized that the industry and the various push factors which I'm going to be describing or talking about will push the industry forward towards green hydrogen. So we have some pilot projects that we're looking at in South Africa, and we've also partnered in other countries. And that's really the state of the industry. The biggest electrolyzer operating in the world is in the 20 megawatt range. I think in the next 2 years, there'll be 100 megawatt electrolyzer. And then the biggest electrolyzer in the world that will come on stream in 2024 is in Neom in Saudi Arabia. It will be 1 gigawatt. It will displace only 15,000 barrels of oil per day. We consume 100 million, roughly, barrels of oil per day. So just to give you an idea of the scale required to get to 20% of oil and gas will require millions of projects globally, most likely distributed projects. So that's the way we see it, and we really focus on how to integrate projects and how to bring all of the elements together, which is water, electricity, the end user. Hydrogen is dissipates easily. So it's great that you can create it, but as soon as you create it, you incur significant costs to either store it, compress it, convert it to ammonia or another energy carrier. And those are some of the challenges that come about in the industry. So in terms of the push factors that are pushing the world to green hydrogen is more costly than other alternatives, but it's becoming more competitive. At the current Dutch TTF price for natural gas and LNG in Europe, green hydrogen is competitive, but that's because of the anomaly around the Ukraine and Russia situation. But long term, we do think with carbon taxes, hydrogen will become more competitive sooner than most people anticipate. So the real push factor is really carbon emissions, and you get a 99.9% reduction in carbon emissions over a 20-year span, 20 to 25-year span of a project being assessed. And the small emissions are due to the fact that when you construct hydrogen or renewable energy equipment or move it around, you have to use the current energy ecosystem, so we need to account for that. But generally, you get a 99.9% reduction in CO2 emissions over a 20 to 25-year project lifespan. And why that is important is as the world moves to decarbonization, there are other push factors that are going to push people to look at all of their inputs in terms of carbon. The one is carbon border taxes, and there's very significant moves in that direction, especially among some of South Africa's major export trading partners, where, for example, if you produce or export even nectarines or fruit, the carbon emissions are going to be measured and tracked, and all along the chain, right up to the consumer, that you might pick it up in a German or UK store. So it's going to be very important to measure and track those, and for South Africa to decarbonize to remain competitive. Then the other push factor is that batteries can do a significant amount in terms of decarbonizing transport, short duration flights, maybe light commercial vehicles. But really the big challenge is for heavy vehicles, for replacing chemicals and fuels, for example, ammonia and fertilizers that all come from the oil and gas industry. And that's where hydrogen is a versatile molecule. And that's where its real role will be in what they call the hard to abate sectors or hard to decarbonize sectors. So really those are the main push factors that are naturally pushing towards green hydrogen. In terms of infrastructure, it's also a good opportunity. We can repurpose pipelines, some of the storage infrastructure to use hydrogen or ammonia or methanol or any other derivative that comes from the green hydrogen value chain. And you can replicate some of the elements of the value chain. So that makes it a very good natural progression that you can bring in more green methanol, let's say, produced from hydrogen, and still be able to maintain some of the value chains as you have the transition. So now to talk about the challenges. So the renewable energy cost is about 70% of the cost of green hydrogen production at current renewable energy prices. And this is over a 20 to 25-year project lifespan. The capital costs are roughly about 20%, and then operations and maintenance 5%, and finance costs about 5%. So it really is renewable energy costs that drive costs. We worked on a pilot project in the UK, and the biggest impediment is that currently the cheapest renewable energy costs that you could get is between 6 and 8 UK pence, which made the hydrogen price twice the price of red diesel, which is the equivalent that they used in marine fuel. So in today's markets, you will need some subsidies or interventions, and both the US, European, and other governments are looking at subsidizing some of these early stage green hydrogen projects. The other thing to be aware of is that for every megawatt of electrolyzer that you build, you need to build 3 to 4 times the renewable energy capacity, because your capacity factors on solar and wind, the best you can get out of an 8,000 hour a year operation for solar in South Africa is probably in the region of 3 to 3,500 hours, which is in the 25 to 30% range. So if you built let's say a bottling plant and you ran it 25% of the time, it wouldn't make sense. So you really need to look at how you incorporate solar with wind, solar with other sources, solar with batteries, so you maximize the operating hours of an electrolyzer. And that's quite important. And that affects economics because it becomes purely operations planning. The longer you run the electrolyzer, the cheaper your hydrogen. So those are some of the factors that need to come in. And then, as I mentioned, the largest plant in operation is not very big. And what we need is to get to gigawatt scale. And that is the urgent challenge. There are various production bottlenecks. Your lead time on an electrolyzer is 18 to 24 months if you put your deposit down. And that I'm talking about the larger megawatt type scale electrolyzers. And those are some of the bottlenecks, but they're also an opportunity because there is an opportunity to look at manufacturing or assembling renewable energy or green hydrogen plants in South Africa, because the whole world cannot rely on 1 or 2 countries for all of the requirements for renewable energy and hydrogen infrastructure. So the last point is the previous energy system was really built around very large projects, moving lots of energy from certain points, and the world is starting to realize that that's not very good. For example, Europe relying on just one pipeline from Russia for most of its energy. So I think the future is going to be more distributed. And while South Africa has very good natural endowments, there are other countries as well. And I think the future energy systems will see many different players playing in this space, and probably smaller to medium-sized projects as well, where demand and supply are co-located much closer than previously seen. So with that, I'll close out my comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ibrahim. Really helpful to give us a industrial perspective, I guess, is what I'm saying. Focusing on the manufacturing, giving us an idea of the various cost structure and breakdown, and highlighting the fact that whilst green hydrogen might not be new, as other speakers on our panel have mentioned, we've still got a lot of work we've got to do. Right, gentlemen, I'd like us now to move to our conversation period, and I think Thabo highlighted a really important point that I'd like us to just think about and make comments on, and that is there's a lot of talk going on around green hydrogen, but putting aside the work that Ibrahim referred to, there's not a lot of action happening. And one of the patterns that I've observed of us as South Africans is we do lots of talking, but we don't do too much doing. So to go to Thabo's question, how do we activate this? And I think it's quite critical that we as South Africans and Africans realize that there are competitors out there, whether it's Chile, whether it's Australia, and these folk are moving, they're doing things. And what we don't want is to have the opportunity gap closed. So what do we need to do to make it start happening for South Africa and for Africa? Who would like to go first?
Yeah, and I think that's a very important question, and we need to separate the hype from what's actually happening. And you're right, we need to show physical projects coming online. I think that's very important. That will create the jobs, that will show our seriousness in the country. I do think, though, that not everything is hype and not everything is talk, because we have seen public projects announced, so projects announced in the public domain in South Africa, and this has been very recent, over the past 6 to 12 months. From our perspective, we also investing in a number of projects, some of them not announced in the public domain, so some of them still confidential. So I want to, provide some encouragement that there's more than a talk. I think there is activity in the sense that companies and some DFIs are investing in project development to get projects to bankability. And those will be some of the ones I mentioned. There will be the hydrogen and derivative production. There's also equipment manufacturing. I don't want to mention specific names, but some of them are in the public domain, and there's those mobility projects. But what do we need to do more? I think that was your question. Very important question. Is that projects, though we do see, although they have been coming, and making themselves known, is not enough from the perspective of what we want to target. So there are targets that we need to aspire towards in terms of clean hydrogen production, and we need more projects. And what we need to do, I think, to encourage more projects and more investment is, firstly, I think there needs to be a very clear signal from government on the seriousness to commercialize this industry and show, I think, a unity. And having said that, I think the role of the presidency is so important, and they have shown, I think, explicitly how supportive they are of this industry, and how we are aware of the coordinating role that they are now fulfilling between government departments. So that's number one. I think number two, it talks to the role of us as DFIs and other financing institutions in being able to provide those kind of support needed from a financing perspective. And we're looking at specifically things like grants. So we need to get grants in to support these projects. And because of the fact that we're not at parity, and we need to start this industry, we need very attractive concessional type of debt facilities. So all of those needs to be brought in. IDC is playing a role by supporting development of projects, but we need more of that. So that's, I think, the second thing. And then I think the third thing is to show a clear signal on some of those regulatory issues. Specifically, I want to mention something like the energy regime, right? If we want to target gigawatt scale production, we need to know, do we need an IRP or what kind of energy planning regime is required? And I think if we have certainty on that, it will really encourage more investors to come in and get projects on the ground. So I think those are the things I think we need, to start getting more activity. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Madrak. Thabo?
Yeah, if I can add, I think quite lucid points from Mahendra. I think one of the things that we notice, I mean, we've, as I alluded, globally, if we look at a large number of pilot plants that we've done and kind of the learnings that we pick up, we suddenly realize that you have to also be good at creating local demand. This local demand would require several partnerships to ensure that you kind of develop the value chain and help to commercialize some of these technologies. But a local demand for green hydrogen also has a benefit in terms of building up the economy, building up the knowledge base that we'll definitely need. But also, as an example of local demand, it has to lie within the transportation industry, for example. So, what about localized transport, cars, buses? I think there's corridors that have been announced, long-range transport, because that seeks to start to stimulate a dynamic and sustainable industry that could be based on green hydrogen. The second aspect has to be export, which is quite an obvious one. And I think this is one where a lot of the projects, if I look at the nature of the projects at the moment, they are mainly geared towards export. But I think there's a lot that we could pick up by ensuring that we create these dynamic industries locally, because those will give us the green skills that we talk about. That's where innovativeness can happen, and also local production will ensue.
Thanks very much, Davor. Ibram, any thoughts?
Yes, yeah, I think we've been looking at green hydrogen for 4 years, and in 2020 you started to see a lot more interest in green hydrogen, and I think last year we saw a lot of commitments from South Africa. So many of the countries, including South Africa, face the same challenge, which is you need a lot of renewable energy to make green hydrogen happen. And all the countries now face one common problem, in that everybody is trying to buy solar panels and wind farms. So that's what's slowing things down. The other thing is the supply chain bottlenecks that emerged because of COVID, but now are prolonging as well, are some of the things that are slowing things down. So I think what's happened is intent has gone up significantly, and we have to commend government for now showing and committing to 2 pillars for its decarbonization strategy, which is new energy vehicles and green hydrogen, and that's a government policy. So I think in terms of our nationally determined contributions, that is what the South African government is committed to. What has happened is, as Mahendra mentioned, a lot of the DFIs and funding institutions have now said, okay, because the government has set the tone, let's see what we can do. The challenge is it takes 5 to 7 years to develop an infrastructure project, and it requires patience. There are a lot of loopholes that you need to go through, and the biggest one is actually finding a buyer. And as Davor mentioned, the challenge remains is that we worked on the maritime project in the UK, so we could produce the hydrogen at twice the price of diesel, and we could get a government subsidy. But then you sit with the other problem in that if, let's say, you have a ferry operator and they have an engine and it runs on diesel, who pays for the conversion of their diesel engine? And that's where in South Africa, we're also going to start to come up with some of those things. So there'll be a market, we can identify it, but it's not that simple, because if you're running a truck fleet on diesel, you have to convert to fuel cells or an internal combustion engine that runs to hydrogen. So who pays for that? How do you convince them that it's more economic? So those are some of the challenges we'll come up with, but there are certainly opportunities, and like I said, it's moving in the right direction, setting the tone. It's going to take time. It's not that simple. It's quite complex, but all of these transitions in energy do take time, and I think we're in the right direction. We could have done more a little bit earlier, but that's the past. I think we're on the right track, and we should just focus on trying to be competitive in this sector and get as many pilot projects off the ground so we can learn from them and scale those pilot projects.
Thank you, Ibram. Jackal, any last words?
Thank you, David. Just touching on what Ibram has also said. So when we look at it again, when we talk about policy and we talk about maybe something that we've been involved in, again, focusing on green transportation in Gauteng specifically. So the Gauteng government is busy with updating it in its Infrastructure Transport Act. And part of that process is also making sure that when we talk about infrastructure, both rail and other forms of infrastructure, that as part of the revitalization of the legislation that enables also investment, is talking about infrastructure such as hydrogen, renewable energy installations at facilities like the Gautrain stations where you build economies around it. So there's a lot of initiatives, and there is actually a draft bill that we have also commented on in trying to ensure that when we talk about green transportation and we talk about climate change, transport is a significant contributor to CO2 emissions, and that is creating demand. So going back to the demand cycle. So when we have the first part of it is, again, production. So production, and Mahindra, Tabo, and Abraham has mentioned, there's a lot of bottlenecks when we talk about, again, regulation in terms of renewable energy. So separating what we require from an electricity generation perspective of the grid to what we require for specifically for hydrogen production. So also changing regulations. There is work streams with the Department of Energy working on that, making sure that regulations around renewable energy production, specifically for hydrogen, also will see the light of day. So there's a lot of moving parts also from a cost perspective in terms of looking at electrolyzers. Ibrahim mentioned, or I think it's Wanda mentioned, the bottlenecks in terms of manufacturing of those electrolyzers. It takes almost 18 to 24 months to get an electrolyzer of scale. So looking at all of those things, and also making sure that from a supply chain perspective, there's also enough incentives for these manufacturers to set up shop in South Africa, to ensure that from a local perspective, we have the capacity to be able to supply the industry, and tapping into the policy incentives and other legislative instruments that we can use from a tax perspective or carbon pricing perspective, carbon tax proposals in respect of, again, fossil fuels, encouraging, disincentivizing using fossil fuels and encouraging using hydrogen, creating the demand for green hydrogen. Thank you, Dave.
Great, thank you very much, Jackal. And thank you very much to all the panelists for your response to how we can make this process start going. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our session. You've heard a very wide-ranging set of views around the issue of green hydrogen in Africa. Lots of potential, lots of exciting times ahead of us. But at the same time, we have a reasonable base to start with. It's not new, but there are lots of challenges that we have to tackle, ranging from regulation through to financing, supply chain issues, understanding the quantum of energy required to produce green hydrogen going through renewable sources. So thank you once again to all my panelists. I appreciate all your input and your time today. I think it's been a really very interesting panel, and thank you very much indeed. Cheerio.